And then the mind or nous began to rotate the apeiron very rapidly. It began to vibrate. It broke into pieces. And this is where objects come from. All right, well, this is not just an ancient doctrine. We find several examples of this in the 20th and early 21st century. I think of the young Levinas of existence and existence, of de l'existence à l'existant, where the world itself, he says, is il y a. It's simply there is. And the human mind has to hypostatize individual objects out of this il y a. So it's human thought that produces objects. Certain works of Jean-Luc Nancy have traces of a similar theory. And even in analytic philosophy, the analytic philosophers James Ladyman and Don Ross in Bristol wrote a popular work about 15 years ago called Everything Must Go, where they deny the existence of objects. They say that the world itself is a single unified mathematical structure, and that individual objects only exist as the correlate of human thought. There are no objects unless humans are there to somehow produce them. And that's paradoxical because Ladyman and Ross try to claim that in some sense they are realists, that not only do they believe you can have a science of nature, a science of plants, a science of chemicals, they even believe you can have a science of traffic jams, since traffic jams exist as what they call real patterns. And yet they think traffic jams only exist as the correlate of the people who are driving, just as plants exist only as the correlate of human botanists who are observing them. So this strange paradoxical embrace of realism and anti-realism at the same time. In any case, I noticed that a number of the papers for this conference seem to be addressing non-objects in terms of that which is indiscernible and inapparent, which makes a lot of sense. I noticed the number of papers on Marion and other phenomenological authors. And one thing I would say about this is that we should not limit ourselves to the idea that either something appears or it does not appear. If we do that, we are essentially trapping ourselves in what is known as Meno's paradox in Plato's dialogue, the Meno, where the lesson is essentially you can't look for something if you already have it, and you can't look for it if you don't, because if you already have it, there's no point in looking. If you don't have it, then you'll never recognize it when you find it. And so a dualism is set up in which we can either perceive something or we can't. Either something is given or it's not. And of course, the very term philosophia denies that dichotomy. Philosophia, of course, is the idea of a love of wisdom that is not quite a wisdom, so that we are approaching the thing, never reaching it. And this leads me to a discussion of the noumenon. Kant's noumenon is a famously controversial concept in the past few centuries of philosophy. Most people reject it. It's interesting that for Kant, the noumenon is really the central concept. It's only the noumenon that allows him to overthrow dogmatic metaphysics and cause us to bring us to limit ourselves to the transcendental conditions of human experience. People will often say that if we try to think something outside thought, we turn it into a thought, right? So that there's no way to have a noumenon. Either we think of something or we don't. And if we don't, there's no point talking about it. And so this leads us on the path of German idealism, where the noumenon really just becomes a special case of the phenomenon, that if we are thinking of something outside thought, it is recuperated by thought. The difference between noumenon and phenomenon is essentially immanent in the phenomenon itself. And it's well known that this is what German idealism does. But what's interesting is Husserl's own rejection of the thing in itself, as the noumenon, is absurd. And one of his famous arguments in his early essay on intentional objects is the idea that if there were two Berlins, if there were a real Berlin in the world outside thought, and then a Berlin about which I think, there would be no way to bridge the gap between those two. It wouldn't be Berlin, the real Berlin about which I am speaking. What has not been noticed is that Kant makes a very similar argument in his treatment of the ontological proof for the existence of gods. Even though Husserl and Kant could hardly be more different on the question of the noumenon, with Husserl rejecting it, Kant embracing it, again, they make a similar argument. Husserl says there cannot be two Berlins, one in thought and one outside thought. And Kant, interestingly, says the noumenal and the phenomenal God must have the same properties. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about God. And so even though Kant is a philosopher of the noumenon which cannot be thought, or can be thought but not known, he seems to think we can know the qualities of God. He says that in his passage in the Critique of Pure Reason about the ontological proof, that the things like greatness and unity, concepts that we apply to God, actually are the same concepts of greatness and unity that are accessible to us through experience. So it seems as if only the existence of God is noumenal for Kant, not the essence, if I can use that language. Anyway, more generally, the problem with Meno's paradox, I think, is that a lot of human communication, a lot of human knowledge has to do with suggestion, hints, innuendo, the interpretation of signs, and do not involve either a direct presence or a complete absence of the things that we are talking about. This goes, of course, as far back as Heraclitus with his two famous fragments, one that nature loves to hide, the other being that the Oracle of Delphi neither speaks nor remains silent, but gives a sign. And of course, Heidegger makes much of this. And I think that's really the first step on the way to the birth of philosophy proper, which is not a knowledge, but a kind of knowledge that also erases itself by the same gesture. So, for instance, when Socrates asks for all these definitions of things in the Platonic dialogues, people often forget that he never reaches a successful definition of anything. I don't remember a single Platonic dialogue where they actually come up with a suitable definition at the end, whether it's friendship or love or virtue or justice. And that's not because Socrates is a failure. It's simply because that is the nature of the beast. There is no way for philosophia to give us Sophia. There is no way to gain direct access to these terms themselves. So something always eludes us. Most pre-Socratic philosophers, I'm accepting Heraclitus here, I would say are not quite philosophers in the strict sense yet, because what they are giving us are certain what I call undermining theories that try to explain all of reality in terms of something more basic that underlies it. So whether it's water for Thales or air for Anaximenes, air, earth, fire, and water for Empedocles, or the apeiron for Anaximander, Pythagoras, or Anaxagoras. This idea that we're simply going downward from the multitude of mid-sized visible things to try to find some foundation for them. This seems more like an example of early physics than early philosophy. As I see it, we get Greek philosophy once the inaccessibility of the real is inscribed in the discourse itself about the real. So Socrates in the Platonic dialogues as being someone who never is able to give a definition. Plato as the one who writes these dialogues. And then surprisingly, Aristotle as well. People sometimes think of Aristotle as having been a scientific classifier of things he is able to know, but people forget a very important statement from Aristotle in the Metaphysics, where he says you cannot define a thing because a thing is always concrete and a definition is made of universals. And so there will always be some energy loss when you're translating a thing into words, translating a thing into thought. And of course, there's nothing mystical about this. This is known in the sciences as well, in mathematics. For instance, you cannot turn the three-dimensional globe of the Earth into a two-dimensional map without distorting the size or shape of the landmasses. That's one example of an incommensurability between two-dimensional and three-dimensional geometries. What about in science itself? Well, if you believe Thomas Kuhn, and I tend to on this point, you can't really say that Newton's theory of gravity and Einstein's theory of gravity are both theories about the same thing called gravity. If you look at the two theories, for instance, you're going to find that many terms don't even mean the same thing. So mass and energy are convertible in Einstein, not in Newton, where they're separate. And so metaphorical language, another example that's going to be important for me today. When you have a metaphorical statement, you cannot cash out that metaphor in terms of literal language. There's no way to say Homer's wine dark sea in the Odyssey means that the wine is basically the same color as the Mediterranean Sea. You're never going to be able to translate the metaphor into literal statements. You can never translate a joke into literal statements. If you say, for instance, a joke I once heard was the favorite in Belgium of a list of 100, and that joke was, there are three kinds of people: those who can count and those who can't. Well, Not so funny, but a little funny. And if you had a small child nearby and the child demanded an explanation, you would have to explain in literal terms that, well, the joke said there were three kinds of people, but then it only gave two, which means the person telling the joke is inscribed themselves in the group of people who can't count. Okay, you've now explained the joke, but it's not funny for anyone anymore because you've replaced a joke by literal language, and the gap in the joke is what makes us laugh. Magic tricks. You ruin a magic trick if you give the secret to it. And I learned at some point that magicians have an international unspoken agreement, or maybe spoken agreement, not to share their tricks with any non-magicians because it would subvert their business. And then one last example that I often come to is threats, because threats are always more powerful when they're not explicit. So you go back to the movie The Godfather, which I'm sure you've all seen. And Don Vito Corleone keeps saying, I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse, which is far more scary than saying, I'm going to cut off his horse's head and put it on his bed at night when he's asleep and he's going to wake up and see blood all over the place. That's no longer a threat. It's grotesque, but it lacks the power to shock and to intimidate that a real threat has. And unfortunately, one of the best threats I've ever heard came from Dick Cheney before the first Gulf War, the one over Kuwait back in the early 90s, when there were rumors that Saddam Hussein was planning to use chemical weapons against the American army. And supposedly Dick Cheney sent a communique to Saddam Hussein that said, if Iraq uses chemical weapons against the United States Army, the United States will respond promptly and decisively in a manner from which it will take Iraq centuries to recover, which is a far more horrifying threat than just saying, if you use chemical weapons, we're going to use nuclear weapons. You've somehow taken away the suspense that makes a threat important. And we can think of all kinds of other areas where innuendo is an important mode of communication. And the modern idea that we either know something or we don't, we either can state something in clear prose terms or we can't say anything about it, is something that runs counter to the very nature of philosophia in the ancient Greek sense. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the way that, at first at least, is the way that philosophy amounts to moving beyond what I will call literalism. Now, to mention Derrida again briefly, Derrida would always say there's no such thing as a literal statement, because for Derrida, the literal means you're making the very essence of a thing present. And of course, for various reasons, he thinks that's impossible. And so there is no such thing as a literal statement. And so the difference between literal and metaphorical essentially disappears for Derrida. However, I want to insist that they are very different because I think they should be defined differently. I think the ultimate literalist in philosophy is David Hume, with his idea that an object is merely a bundle of qualities, or that the mind is merely a bundle of perceptions. This is a way of denying that there is any gap between a thing and its qualities, that a thing simply is the sum total of all the properties that it has. There's nothing in the object over and above the properties it has. And there are several implications of this, one of them being that even the most minor change in a thing makes it a different thing entirely because you've changed the bundle of qualities. I see Husserl as a great anti-Humean in this sense, even if there are senses in which Husserl's an empiricist. It's in a very different sense from Hume because Husserl is the very opposite of a bundle of qualities theorist. The intentional object remains the same, even though its qualities are changing constantly in the form of adumbrations. This is something Hume would not have been able to think. And so it's interesting that in a sense, Husserl revives the ancient concept of substance, though he's talking about it in phenomenal terms. Because Aristotle, remember, was talking about a substance as something that can have opposite qualities at different times, or as something that itself does not have an opposite. So there's no opposite of Socrates, and yet Socrates can be happy one day and sad the next. And we see Husserl with a similar insight within the phenomenal realm, the idea that there's a difference between an object and its qualities. The object is the bearer of shifting qualities. And that is already a step beyond literalism. If literalism is, as I've defined it, the idea that an object is merely a bundle of qualities. So how else do we get beyond literalism? I want to talk about metaphor again. When you consider once more Homer's metaphor from the Odyssey, the wine dark sea, where he's talking about the Mediterranean, it might look at first as if the poet is saying, hey, did you ever notice that the Mediterranean Sea is the same color as wine? which is probably not literally true. And even if it were literally true, a pure banality. It wouldn't really matter if they were just similar in color. That's not really what happens. What happens is that the color becomes a kind of pretext to identify the wine and the sea at a deeper level with all sorts of properties that they don't literally share. For instance, you have wine dark sea. The sea in that metaphor also borrows the danger, the intoxication, and the oblivion of wine. It's suggesting that the sea is somehow both liberating and endangering through the way it intoxicates us and the way we can lose ourselves in it, as if in alcohol. That's one example of a non-literal statement. Also, I would point out in passing that metaphorical statements are not reversible in the way that literal language is. So you can say a pen is like a pencil is like a pen. It doesn't make a difference, because what you're doing in that case is you're simply pointing out that a pen and a pencil share many qualities in common. They're both long, skinny, and make dark marks on paper or some other medium that allows us to read written language. That does not work with metaphor. You can say wine dark sea, and you can also say sea dark wine, but those are two different metaphors. Why is that? Why is that metaphorical language does that when literal language does not? Why is metaphorical language not reversible? It turns out the reason is that in a metaphor, the two terms compared play asymmetrical roles. When you say wine dark sea, you have the sea as an object being given the qualities of wine. And if you say sea dark wine, you have wine as an object being given the qualities of the sea. And so those are two very different metaphors. The other thing is that you can make literal statements and judge literal statements when standing at a certain distance from them, a kind of cool assessment of the meaning of a prose statement and whether you agree with it or not. In the case of metaphor, it's different because, for instance, wine dark sea, well, we are not familiar with a literal object called a wine dark sea. And the effort to make a sea have wine-like qualities is something we have to work hard at in our minds, or at least somewhat hard. And for some people, it fails. Certainly for a small child would probably get nothing out of reading wine dark sea. A person who does not speak English would get nothing out of reading wine dark sea in English, even if they read ancient Greek. And so there's a certain personal effort involved in making the wine dark sea come to life. We have a personal investment in its existence, and for this reason, our belief in the wine dark sea is an essential part of its existence, because it doesn't really exist there if our efforts cease. In a sense, we are parts of the wine dark sea because we have to perform its existence. If we stop doing that, there is no wine dark sea. Now, there's a related phenomenon, and that would be speech act theory, which, of course, points out famously a difference between constative and performative statements. And constative statements are analogous to what I've called literal statements here. So if I simply say it's 65 degrees Fahrenheit outside this morning, that's simply a statement. But if I tell you, I promise to tell you the accurate temperature for Los Angeles this morning, and then it turns out that I lied about it or that I misreported it somehow, there are consequences for me if that happens. Right? I've lost my reputation as a reliable conveyor of meteorological information. And so in all kinds of different ways, statements quickly cease to be literal statements and pick up other aspects. As with the metaphor, you have to actually be personally performing that aesthetic experience in order for the metaphor to exist. The same with speech act theory, the idea that in certain kinds of statements, we are implicating ourselves more deeply than in certain other kinds of statements, like promises being the famous example. And then if you're familiar at all with Alain Badiou's philosophy in France today, although Badiou is very much a philosopher of truths, as he calls them, truths being experiences of truths that go beyond any specific situation. And of course, Badiou is a committed leftist, and so for him, the only political truth is the communist invariant, as he calls it. There are also truths in love, art, and science for Badiou. But what's really interesting about his theory is that these truths require personal fidelity. It's almost like Kierkegaard. It's almost like the truth for Badiou is not an objective matter, but it requires someone to commit themselves to recollecting and reenacting a truth. And so if, say, there's the French Revolution, someone who was opposed to the French Revolution at the same time, at the time it happened, might just say, there is no such thing as a French Revolution. there were just a bunch of individual, isolated, violent acts that some people call a French Revolution. But you would say the people who really reenact the French Revolution are the ones in the Russian or Chinese Revolution who try to repeat it in their own context and so forth. So there are signs of this coming back. Oh, Michael Polanyi, of course, some of you may know his work, another philosopher for whom belief is very much more a component of truth than radical doubt, because he famously thinks radical doubt is impossible, that we always begin from a context in which we have countless beliefs in many different things, and we can only change those beliefs piecemeal into other beliefs. We can never radically distance ourselves from all beliefs. Bruno Latour, finally, one last example I will give. Bruno Latour, the great critic of modernity, which Latour and Husserl would have had a great argument about this, because Husserl is very much a modernist of the core, whereas for Latour, you can't make a radical separation between physical matter of the universe, which is dead and works with arbitrary clockwork mechanical precision. On the other hand, humans who project their own subjective values and purposes onto a cold universe of dead gray matter. For Latour, those things are all mixed, and so therefore you cannot take up a radical position against belief. Everyone always believes in something. We cannot define Western modernity as the one that has knowledge rather than belief, because there's always a component of belief in any form of knowledge. All right. In any case, to repeat something I said a few minutes ago, philosophy is usually obsessed with the gap between reality and appearance, even if we decide to deny that gap and say that there is no in itself, that reality is given as it is. And then there are others who say it's not, that we need a representational theory of truth because we can never get at the thing itself. But that's not the only gap that we need to worry about. The other gap I've already mentioned is the difference between an object and its qualities. And the reason Husserl is so important here is because despite his distrust of the noumenal realm and his declarations that it's absurd, he very much has a distinction between the object and its qualities, which David Hume, as I mentioned, does not. And this is analogous to Leibniz's distinction that I mentioned early in the monadology, where Leibniz says the monad is one, but it also must be many. Otherwise, all monads would be alike. They would be indiscernible from each other. And you could say that for Husserl, each intentional object is one, but of course, it's also different from all of the other intentional objects. So that's one way of dealing with the term non-objects, in the sense that I noticed some of the papers in this conference were identifying the phrase non-object with that which does not appear, that which is not discernible. I saw some references to the saturated phenomenon from Marion and so forth. But there's another way to look at the phrase non-objects, and that has to do with qualities. You know, Aristotle says being is said in many ways, and one of those is that substance and accident are two different ways of saying being. And so you cannot speak of qualities in the same way that you can speak of objects, right? That an object can bear other qualities. A quality does not bear different objects. We say the car is red, we never say the red is car. And that's not just because of the fault of Indo-European languages, it's because that's how we experience the world. We experience the world as objects bearing qualities rather than the reverse. So in the later Brentano, in the theory of categories, there's the form of his doctrine called reism, where you're dealing with concrete things of which all of the qualities are parts, rather than having qualities that are separate from the things. Now, it's an innovative turn by Brentano late in his career, but one of the problems there, I think, is that when we do that, we lose the looseness of connection between objects and qualities. And in a way, that's what I'm arguing for today when I argue against literalism. The idea that the relation between a thing and its qualities is a loose one. There's a wedge you can drive between those. And this is what makes it possible for objects to change qualities. Maybe my favorite funny line from Aristotle's Metaphysics. If it's not the philosopher, then who is to say whether Socrates and Socrates sitting down are the same? I guess that's a summary of what we do as philosophers, try to figure out whether Socrates and Socrates sitting down are the same. Well, as dry as that sounds, the interesting nucleus there is the fact that Socrates always has qualities, but Socrates is not identical with any of them. Yes, there are going to be some essential qualities for everything that exists. Otherwise, an orange would be the same as an apple. There are certain things not subject to eidetic variation. This is how we find the essence of things in phenomenology. Yet there's a certain looseness between a thing and at least most of its qualities. Let's turn to a famous example from philosophical discourse, the ship of Theseus. And you know the example, but just as a refresher, the ship of Theseus, which was sent to the island to make a sacrifice for Theseus for having killed the Minotaur and having saved Athens. What if one piece of wood is rotting on the ship of Theseus, and so you replace that piece with a new piece, and then the next year a second piece of wood is rotting on the ship, so you replace that with a fresh piece, until finally, after a certain number of centuries, all of the wood has been replaced on the ship of Theseus. And meanwhile, someone has been taking the old pieces of wood and reassembling them into a new ship of Theseus. Question being, which of those ships is the real ship? You have one that has all the original wood, but then the other one that was the original form of the ship and was only replaced gradually. And there's often healthy philosophical debates about which of these is the real ship. I even know of at least one case, Peter Simons, an interesting analytic philosopher, who says that actually they're both Theseus's ship. The original ship of Theseus now has two successors, just as the Catholic Church had two popes for a while. I think a better way to look at this, though, is that neither of those is the real ship. Why should it be assumed that the way to have the ship of Theseus is to preserve detail? I think in a way, you get more of a handle on the essence of a thing if you strip away detail, something that phenomenology also knows well through eidetic variation. So I once wrote an article not that long ago, a few years ago, arguing that we should speak about the shipwreck of Theseus. Imagine that the ship of Theseus wrecks, it's at the bottom of the ocean, it loses a lot of its pieces of wood, yet somehow there will be something that captures the spirit of the ship of Theseus at the bottom of the sea, even though a lot of it's no longer a functional ship. A lot of the wood has been rotted. And so a lot of times you get at the thing more when you renovate it, when you take away the unnecessary detail, focus on what's really essential in the thing, and then modify the outside parts of it. So consider the example of the burning down, the burning of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I haven't been there to see. I don't even know whether it's finished yet, but I think it's at least close to being finished. And of course, by broad public acclaim, I think they're rebuilding it exactly as it was because it's such a famous historical artifact. Some architects, however, were making the case to rebuild it in a slightly different way that captures the essence of it. So the spire was going to be partly glass and transparent, according to some of these plans. And most of the French public did not want this. Certainly most members of the Catholic Church did not want this. But you could see why some architects would see this as an alternative. That if you rebuild a thing in exactly the same form it had originally, what you're doing in a way is saying that Notre Dame is all its details. When actually, there'd be a more essentialist approach to say that Notre Dame has a certain, I know not what, a je ne sais quoi that defines the essence of the cathedral. And we're going to leave that, and we're going to accentuate it precisely by changing some of the details, by creating a glass, half-transparent spire and so forth. Architects talk about this in many contexts of renovation, and they don't always involve sacred buildings like cathedrals, but architects often try to consider rebuilding structures in a way that is slightly different from the original, especially in recent architecture. And they're not doing that simply to be irreverent or flippant. Sometimes they're doing it as a way of trying to capture what the object is really about by accentuating some of its features and abandoning others of its features. I'm reminded of an interesting remark Nietzsche makes about childhood photos, which is that we in old age, we resemble our childhood photos more than we do our middle-aged or early adult selves. And I think his idea there was that as a child, you are somehow expressing your own reality and the innocence of your face. And then as you go through life, you lose that, you become less authentic, you become tempted by the demands of others. And then in old age, you drift back towards your more essential self. You become more detached from all the compromises you had to make along the way. So it's an interesting idea. This idea that there's something essential in your baby photo that is then lost and it's then re-excavated in old age. Okay. Let me also talk about the word surplus here. Surplus is probably one of the most under-discussed important terms in philosophy. it has a dual ambiguous sense. You may remember Hegel talking in the Logic about what he called speculative words and claiming that German is especially rich in speculative words, things like Aufhebung, which both means to destroy and to preserve. Well, surplus also means both things, because on the one hand, you could speak in surplus in the sense of Aristotelian substance, that I know the tree, and yet the tree is much deeper than anything I know about it. The tree is inexhaustible, it's concrete, and all of my knowledge uses universals. So in that sense, you can think of the tree as having a surplus that's deeper than any of my knowledge of it. But you can also think of surplus in exactly the opposite sense, meaning that the qualities of a thing are a kind of surplus. They've been added to the essence of the thing. It doesn't matter that somebody is wearing a specific red coat right now. That's a kind of surplus on top of their essence. They can wear a green coat or no coat and still be the same person. And this is the side where Marx's surplus value, no doubt, comes in, right? That once you have completed the essential industrial function, there is a surplus value which, for Marxists, is immorally taken away from the workers who produced it and given to the capitalists. Well, we don't necessarily need to agree with that, but that's their reading of it. They're reading anyway that surplus is something on the surface that is then shifted around from the workers who created it to the person who provided the means of production. And hello, I can't see the room anymore. Okay, let me try clicking on this phone. Okay, there we are. And of course, in Lacan's psychoanalysis, there's also a discussion of surplus jouissance, surplus enjoyment, that Zizek has picked up on, that's closer to Marx's sense of surplus than to one that has to do with hidden depths. And along with Aristotle, of course, we have Heidegger as a philosopher of hidden depths, someone who thinks that the truth is only unveiled, that it never becomes directly present to us, yet it is there. That the hammer breaks because the hammer is not simply its function, but the hammer has a surplus of properties, which are occasionally go wrong in a way that disrupts the function of the hammer. So there's something in the tools more than their action, even though sometimes Heidegger's tool analysis, or oftentimes, is read as saying that the tool is nothing more than its assignment to certain purposes. In fact, if that were true, the tool could never break. What is really typical of the tool in Heidegger is that there is always more surplus reality in it than any use of it can ever unlock. And so I regret the tendency in recent analytic philosophy to see Heidegger as someone who merely teaches us about the difference between linguistic and sublinguistic representation, or between theory and praxis. You even get, for instance, I think it was Richard Rorty, who said that other than 10,000 pages of historical writings, Dewey basically already said everything that Heidegger did, because they're both talking about praxis. Well, Heidegger's not really talking about praxis. He's talking about something that's deeper than praxis, being. Because without something that's deeper than praxis, praxis would never go wrong. All right. As another form of surplus in the history of philosophy, I wanted to call our attention to emanation in Neoplatonic philosophy. Philosophers go in and out of fashion over the years, of course, even classic philosophers. I remember when I started graduate school, the most out of fashion philosopher was Plato. Everyone was trying to overturn Platonism or reverse Plato, and you were getting this from people as different as Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida. This was my early graduate school experience. Nobody could be a straightforward defender of Plato without looking naive. Well, that has now changed. For various reasons, but Plato became very fashionable again in continental philosophy, more in the early 21st century, late 90s. And so now I think it's Aristotle who's the least fashionable philosopher. Aristotle, if it's not St. Thomas Aquinas. These are philosophers that people in the continental tradition don't usually do much with unless they have a special historical interest in those figures. But I think another is Plotinus. Who these days really reads Plotinus except as a historical exercise, except to go back and figure out why Neoplatonists took this approach to reality? So what are we losing when we don't take Neoplatonic philosophy seriously? Well, obviously there are some parts of ancient philosophies that we don't like to retain. So for instance, when Aristotle assumes that living species are eternal, Darwin makes us want to question that. And so maybe we don't want to commit ourselves to the eternal existence of species. Maybe we like to think that natural kinds can evolve, even if we like Aristotle. In the case of Neoplatonism, there are certain aspects of Neoplatonism that have been called into question seriously by modern astronomy. For example, if you go back and look at Islamic Neoplatonism of the Middle Ages, people like Avicenna and Al-Farabi have a tendency to see emanations as occurring literally between the different planets. So the fixed stars emanates the sphere of Saturn, and Saturn emanates the sphere of Jupiter, Jupiter emanates the sphere of Mars. And it's, of course, very impossible for us moderns or postmoderns to take that seriously, because we believe there is abundant evidence that these planets are rock or gas, that they're not layers of divine emanation. And so that's one aspect of Neoplatonism that people don't want to talk about much after Darwin and after Galileo and Newton. It seems very unfeasible. Well, but what about emanation itself? Well, in a way, emanation is simply a way to give a metaphysical theory of accidents and how accidents arise, or how qualities arise. So if you go back to the Enneads of Plotinus and look at how the emanations occur, they start because the one is somehow out of step with itself. In the McKenna translation, it's called a self-quest. The one somehow wants to grasp itself or approach itself, but for this very reason, there's a difference between the two ones, the one that is grasping and the one that is being grasped. And as a result, there is an emanation, and this emanation can be called intellect. And then from intellect, you can get soul. And so you have three primal hypostases in Plato, in Plotinus. And then on a more homely daily level, you have things like baking a chocolate cake, where the goal is to make the cake. The goal is not to make a chocolate smell spread throughout the entire building. And yet this is exactly what happens. And I'll just read you a very brief passage from Plotinus here. All existences, as long as they retain their character, produce about themselves, from their essence, in virtue of the power which must be in them, some necessary outward-facing hypostasis continuously attached to them and representing an image, the engendering archetypes. Thus fire gives out its heat. Snow is cold not merely to itself. Fragrant substances are a notable instance, for as long as they last, something is diffused from them and perceived wherever they are present. So the fact that a thing is somewhat in conflict with itself is what makes the thing give something itself to the environment, so that a fragrance also emanates onto other objects that are somewhat distant from the object that's causing the fragrance, and so forth. So that, I think, is an important idea, because what he is suggesting is that qualities come as a kind of surplus of when two things meet. Two things meet and form a new third object, and yet certain of their properties are not compatible with each other, and those are the ones that become the qualities. To give you a more concrete example, I talked about the wine-dark sea and how the color similarity of the wine and the sea in that metaphor are simply the bare functional minimum that allows us to bring wine and sea together in our minds. But what really grasps our attention in the metaphor of the wine-dark sea is everything else. If we're thinking about the wine-dark sea, even though the color seems to be the literal similarity between them, the color is probably the last thing we are experiencing when we are considering the wine-dark sea. Instead, we are considering all of those leftover or surplus other qualities from the wine, and wondering how they would attach themselves to the sea. The intoxicating power, the danger of alcohol, the liberation of alcohol, and so forth. And so this is metaphysically speaking, this is a possible origin of qualities, that you get a quality when two things combine partially, and then it's the accidental stuff by which the things do not resemble each other that actually becomes the object of our, not the object of our attention, the matter of our attention. And I also wanted to point out that you might look back at Fichte's theory of the Wissenschaftslehre, and the way he says that the thinking subject also involves the same sort of ambiguity between two and one. That thought posits itself as thinking, and also that minimal non-identity between the two kinds of thinking is what gives rise to the rest of Fichte's philosophy. That's the principle from which the rest of German idealism emanates. And so emanation is probably going to make a comeback at some point in philosophical discourse. And what does Plotinus say? Well, Plotinus also says the one is both one and two, because of course the one is Plotinus's most important concept. He says the one is both one and two. It is one in the sense that it's just one, but it's two in the sense that the one is also turned back towards itself. And so therefore the one is two in the sense that fire emits heats, or snow emits colds. And he says the one emits an image of its self-quest, meaning that the one is somehow trying to coincide with itself, but it can't. And this is what gives rise to everything else other than the one in reality. Well, there's also a passage in Phenomenology. I can't at the moment remember whether it was Husserl or Brentano who said this. There's a great remark about intentionality being both one and two, in the sense that obviously intentionality is two, in the sense that there's an intentional object aimed at by an intentional act, but there's also a sense in which an intentional act is a unified thing. Someone from outside can look at your intentional act and analyze it as though it were one object, one thing. So again, that gap between the two things allows everything else in reality to be generated, according to Neoplatonism. And I want to end this with one final example. And that example is from Lacan. And Lacan's critique of Descartes, I think, is not talked about in the right way always. Famously, when Jacques Lacan talks about cogito ergo sum, his central argument is that the cogito and the sum are not the same I, that there's a minimal difference between those two. This, for Lacan, is why modern philosophy fails in a certain sense. There's no coincidence between those two. And he actually pushes it a bit further in riskier ways. He goes so far actually as to say this is why Russell's paradox isn't really a paradox. Because the set of all sets that are not members of themselves, that's actually occurring in two different registers, just like I think, therefore I am is occurring in two different registers. Lacan proclaims himself equally unimpressed with the paradox I am lying, the Cretan liar's paradox, because the I who says it and the I who lies are two different I's, according to Lacan, even though that's hidden by the grammar of the sentence. And so this minimal non-identity between two sides of the I, or two sides of the one in Plotinus, creates a gap or a surplus that is what ultimately gives rise to qualities. And qualities, as I have said, are perhaps the main sense of what non-object means, because qualities belong to objects. Qualities can be objectified, but then they've turned into something else. Like you could say redness if you think it exists, but then it's become something else. It's no longer a quality, it's a substantized quality. All right, so I think I've gone along long enough here. I will stop there, and if there's any time for questions, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sam, am I allowed, is the sound online?
You are currently muted. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay, I hope. Well, I can.
Maybe it'll just
I
be
can
best to
do
work
it.
through.
Yes. So how shall we do it so that it's here and online?
This microphone will pick you up.
Okay, thank you. Graham, thank you very much. We have time for 2 questions.
Okay.
Yes, okay, so questions from the audience and also questions online, please.
Yes, so first of all, loved the talk. I'm a huge fan of your work. And I was just wondering if you see a connection with the Plotinus quote that you gave, the one is both 1 and 2 because it is turned back on itself, and whether you see a connection there between that and, say, Nietzsche's bad conscience via Judith Butler.
Hadn't thought of that. Can you say a little more?
Well, Butler describes bad conscience as the super ego being turned back on the id by the ego, and thus creating a shell around the subject, which then causes the ego to treat itself as bad. And so it was just a similar mechanic that I heard there. So I was wondering if there might be something more.
The question then would be, how would you interpret good conscience, or how would you interpret narcissism? Because it sounds like the definition Butler gives of bad conscience could be applied to lots of different experiences other than bad conscience. What makes bad conscience so unique in that respect?
The moral aspect, I would say, the fact that it is imposed upon by society via the superego, and that the ego then does it to itself as a mirror to that.
I think that, yeah, there's something more that could be said here. I think there's definitely a connection. I brought up psychoanalysis, of course, in the case of Lacan, but yeah, there are a lot of ways in which the doubling of the ego could be interpreted in the terms I've used today. I don't have any specific thoughts about Butler's reading of Nietzsche because I'm not familiar with that part of her work.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Then second question. Well,
Christos has one.
Christos has a question online. Kirill.
I wanted to ask about the Neoplatonic emanation as you were discussing. Okay, I will speak louder. You hear me now? I hope so. Okay. Is that emanation a sort of unilateral or is it a bilateral process between, say, the agent and the object? Is it from the agent to the object simply just that? Or is it kind of a two-way process as well? And is there, in sort of second part of the question, is there sort of an underlying unification that happens through this process of emanation? Or is there a underlying unity that enables the process of emanation?
I'm inclined to say the latter, but you also brought up a point at the beginning of your question that I simply forgot to bring up, which is whether this process is unidirectional or bidirectional. And that's a problem in Plotinus's theory, that it's hierarchical and it works only in one direction. And at each stage of the emanation, you're getting something worse than the one, and even further removed from the one. Whereas I'm not sure if there's ever been a horizontal or democratic theory of emanation where things are emanating qualities towards each other, but that's sort of what I was driving at today, right? That any time an object experiences another object as having qualities, that's a horizontal form of emanation. The surplus of the thing is leaking out. What you're encountering of the thing is what is inessential to it rather than what's essential to it. And I can do that back to the object in return, or back to another human in return. So yes, I think that's the right way to do it. In Plotinus, I don't think there's any sense of bidirectionality. I think it's one direction only. Whereas in metaphor, I tried to say that metaphor can go in two different directions, but then it's two different metaphors. And I don't think there is anything unifying those unless it's one mind that experiences both of those metaphors in succession. So if I say wine dark sea, sea dark wine, and I'm actually taking the trouble to try to experience those metaphors in my mind, then you get a kind of juxtaposition of the two. But I don't think they exist simultaneously, unless there's some psychoanalytic example in which they can exist simultaneously. But it's interesting how often these kinds of reversals come up in psychoanalysis. Again, Lacan, I'm thinking of the big deal he makes out of the difference between ideal ego and ego ideal, starting in his second seminar, and how in a way you could almost build the whole of his thought out of that minimal gap between two things that simply look like the reversals of each other. But just like wine dark sea and sea dark wine, they're actually very different, completely different things. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what it makes me think of.
Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe one more question online.
Okay.
Please, Christos, but please be concise. We have like 2 minutes.
I will be
Sure.
quick. I will just express my my great appreciation for everything. Looking forward to the book. And the question is on philosophia and Sophia. It's often said that there's no ways from man to God and only from God to man. And yet there is a sense in which one becomes gods through one's work. I wonder whether you could comment something on that.
Yes, although it would be a very atypical kind of work in philosophy, because rather than producing a knowledge or rather than producing an object, in a sense, you're producing non-knowledge. You're producing a kind of cognition that is other than knowledge. And I didn't talk much about this today, but I've written about the way that there are only two forms of knowledge, and I call them undermining and overmining. If someone asks you what something is, you can either tell them what it's made of or you can tell them what it does. Those are really the only two kinds of answers you can give, or you can do both of them simultaneously. And so knowledge either breaks things down to their pieces or reduces things upward to their effects, whereas what we're going for is what's in between those two, in the sense that water is not just H2O. Water does things like put out fire that hydrogen and oxygen cannot do. And water is also something deeper than the ability to put out fires and quench animal thirst. So the object is always something kind of a midway between two different kinds of knowledge that cannot quite get at it. And this is why we need an oblique approach to objects, we need forms of cognition that are not knowledge. That the arts obviously do this. If you're experiencing an artwork and you're interpreting the artwork, you're not just going to tell people that this painting is 75% oil and 25% canvas. That's not very enlightening as far as it's an artwork. And you're also not going to say, this painting makes me feel sad. Okay, well, that may be a helpful thing to know about yourself, but that's not really critical art interpretation, where you're trying to talk about the object, not just the effects it has on you personally. Or in the case of Picasso's Guernica, you can't just say this is a painting about the Spanish Civil War, because even though it is, in 500 years, probably almost no one but historians will even remember the Spanish Civil War. And yet presumably that painting could still be considered a great painting by the art historians of 500 years from now. And so philosophy, much like the arts, is always trying to get somewhere in between those two things. And what do we think of as the gold standard of knowledge? In the modern era, it's science. And yet the knowledge that science gives us isn't really truth, because science constantly has to sacrifice its theories through the history of scientific theories. And in a way, science is more about justification than it is about truth. We talk about knowledge as justified true belief often. The problem is, I don't think justified true or belief are compatible with each other at all. These are three very different things. Because insofar as something is justified, it's really justified false belief, because we know there will be different justifications in the future or falsifying evidence later. So, for instance, Newton, in his theory of gravity, simply assumes that gravity happens at infinite speed, which, since Einstein, we think we know is impossible, because the speed of light is the maximum speed for any information. And Newton, in his correspondence, actually says that he doesn't really believe that gravity happens at infinite speed. He just sort of assumes it as an axiom of his theory. It's too hard to deal with gravity in his theory that would be not at infinite speed. And then Einstein figures out later how to do that. But that's an example of among many others, where scientists, when something is scientifically proven, that doesn't mean you have to believe it. That means that's something you can say plausibly in public discussion, right? So for example, a scientist who has a hunch that present day physics is all wrong is still going to talk in public as though present day physics basically gets it right. They are only doing research on another theory because they have a hunch that the current deadlock between quantum theory and general relativity has to do with certain underlying errors in our thought about nature, but they can't come out and say that yet because they don't have the evidence. So that's a case where you have a double conscience among scientists, where there's that which is justified and that which they really believe and are searching for justification for. So I've forgotten your original question. I'm sorry, but
I think that's a beautiful response to it, though. Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Graham.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so now I'm very happy to introduce. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, who is Michel Bitbol. Can we have Michel on? Okay, he is. Michel, you are a little bit dark. Yes,
I know I'm dark. I'm sorry. I have an insufficiency of light. I'm so sorry. But at any rate, I'll project my slides, so I think the slides will be clear, unlike my face.
Thank you. So let me say a few words. So Michel Bitbol is an emeritus senior researcher in the philosophy of science at the French National Center for Scientific Research, and he is also based at the Husserl's Archive, École Normale Supérieure Paris, the main department of phenomenology in France. So, and his talk is titled "A Physics with No Object, ? Quantum Physics and Phenomenology." So, Michel, we have the audience here and also online.
Thank you very much, Olga, for presenting me. I'm very happy to be with you, even virtually. So the title of my talk is like an oxymoron, a physics with no objects. Usually it is said that every scientific domain has its specific object. So biology would have living beings, psychology would have minds as an object, and physics is usually taken to be the science of material objects, or even the science of matter. And the idea that this object called material objects or bodily objects could be missing somehow to physics seems very strange. And yet it is the case. And it is the case in quantum physics, especially. You know, in this case, if it is true that the object, the usual standard object of physics, namely material or bodily object, might be missing in a certain branch of physics, is a very strong incentive to rely on a discipline that is devoted to making a sort of archaeology of our knowledge and belief in objects. And this discipline that is supposed to make an archaeology of our belief in objects is nothing other than phenomenology. As you know, phenomenology has all, you know, has a deconstructive premise, which is called epoche or reduction, I must say. And on the other hand, it has also a constructive step, which is the step called the constitution of objects and the constitution of objectivity in general, like in Kant. Okay, but how can we reach such an extreme conclusion that nowadays physics, the current physics, may be lacking the notion of its own object? In order to understand this, we have also to understand how we come to the conviction that there are objects. We come to the conviction that there are objects through the grasping of their individuality, namely by distinguishing some regions of what appear, we call these regions an object. So in order to believe that there are objects, we have to believe that there are different objects, that we can distinguish them from one another, that we can individualize them. But how can we individualize such regions of appearance in order to treat them as objects? There are three ways to do that, and the three ways are connected with three modes of our being in the world. The three modes of our being in the world that are relevant in order to pick some sort of distinctness or individuality of objects are essentially language, perception, and essentially spatial or temporal coordination. So the three essential attitudes are speaking, perceiving, and moving, and coordinating the actions we do in space and time. So if we just speak, we usually use the structure of the proposition, namely a subject and a predicate, and a verb to be, which is called the copula, which connects the subject and the predicate. So the usual understanding of individuality of objects, according to the model of language, especially Leibniz has insisted upon, is one in which you have an absolutely existing individual that is able to bear several properties. But the problem, as you know, is that ordinary language becomes inadequate, except at a microscopic scale in the new physics. And since it has become impossible to use properly this structure of the proposition in microphysics, one has in fact transposed the structure of the proposition to concepts that are usually not the same as we use in classical and macroscopic physics. For instance, one would say that in microphysics, a microsystem is in a given state. So apparently you have kept the structure of the proposition because system holds the position of a subject and state holds the position of a predicate. But in fact, when you dig a little bit into this, you realize that what is called the state is not, it's no state at all, but just an assessment of probability. And when you dig a little bit in the notion of system, you realize that it has no proper criterion of individuality left. So there is a problem. Now, the second way we can use in order to assess and to promote the individuality of something is by perception. But of course, perception is hardly available at the micro scale, but you can replace perception with, for instance, measurements or probing with special detectors and so on and so on. At any rate, either detectors or sense organs let us access to just to properties. For instance, for an ordinary body, the property can be to be orange, to be small, to be spherical, and so on and so on. And in this case, if you just rely on perception, if you don't have the underlying belief of the inherent individuality of something that is bearing the properties, then you should say, as Leibniz, that there is, or there should be, the identity of indiscernibles. Namely, if two entities have exactly the same properties, then they are exactly identical. There is no such thing as inherent underlying individuality below the level of just manifest properties. In quantum mechanics, in quantum mechanics, there are cases in which you have strict identity of observable features, and yet that doesn't exclude multiplicity. So in quantum physics, usually the Leibniz principle of the identity of indiscernibles, as we will see, is violated. So here again, we have a problem. So you see, we have a problem with the structure of language in quantum physics. We have a problem with the principle of identity of indiscernibles. So what about the last criterion, the spatial criterion, which says that an object can be distinguished from another object if and only if it holds a different position in space. Now, what if we try to make a permutation between these two objects? Will object 2 become identical to object 1 when it holds the position of object 1, while object 1 will become identical to object 2 when it holds the position of object 2? In this case, that would mean that there is nothing more to the objects than their position in space. The problem in quantum physics is that even this criterion of distinction and individuality is missing. Why? Because there is the so-called uncertainty relations. The assessment of spatial position is also submitted to uncertainty or to indetermination, which means that we can well have a blurring of the positions of 1 and 2, and therefore mix them up and mistake one for another. So you see, all the usual criteria of individuality are missing in the quantum domain. Okay, so in fact, the first time it became clear that something wrong was going on with the concept of individuals, and therefore with the concept of separate objects, was when Satyendra Bose showed that in order to recover the proper statistics of photons and the proper formula that gives, for instance, the radiation of a black body, in order to do that, you have to accept that you do not count separately two permutations of two elements. In usual, classical statistical physics, you may try to distribute two objects called A and B, say to the left or to the right, or in the state called left and in the state called right. And in that case, you have four cases. The case in which A and B is at the left, the case in which A and B are both at the right, and the cases in which A is at the left and B at the right, or conversely. But both showed that, these two intermediate cases in which A is at the left and B is at the right, or conversely, in fact, are tantamount to the same case, and they should be counted only once, not two. So this is the case in the so-called Bose-Einstein statistics. But, you can obtain this result only if you cannot distinguish between A and B. Therefore, if you are compelled to admit that A and B cannot be distinguished, they are not individuals at all. They are just numbers, abstract numbers, populating two states without any mark of individuality, and therefore without any mark of objecthood. So, this was the first sign in quantum physics that the very notion of objecthood was in jeopardy. It was really threatened by the formalism of quantum mechanics and its experimental success. Okay, now let's try to see if there can be many modes of being discernible individuals. For maybe the modes we have listed before are not the only ones. And maybe there are modes of being discernible that can be applied in the quantum domain, whereas they are not useful in the classical domain. So the usual case is that in which two objects are inherently discernible if they have all distinct properties. This is the case that was stated by Leibniz, and that we connected with the principle of indiscernibility. But there are other kinds of discernibility that can occur. For instance, the hierarchical discernibility. Two things are hierarchically discernible if there is an asymmetric order relation between them. For instance, when one can be said more than the other, more larger than the other, or having a bigger volume than the other. In that case, even if all their other properties are similar, for instance, they are all, say, orange spheres, the fact that one is bigger than the other imposes a distinction between them. One can also imagine a criterion of relative discernibility if there is a symmetric yet irreflexive relation between them. For example, if one is at the distance d from 2, in that case, even though they can be absolutely identical on the plane of their qualities, of their properties, one should distinguish them because there is an irreflexive relation between them, which is A is at distance d from B, or 1 is at distance d from 2. It is the case also, especially in quantum physics, by the relation having a z component of spin opposed to the other, okay? A has a z component of spin opposed to the other, even though the two are absolutely identical from all the other standpoints, namely they have the same mass, the same electric charge, the same everything. The z component of one is opposed to the z component of the other. So, and this is exactly the case that characterizes the so-called fermions in quantum physics. And finally, there is an even weaker case of distinction that one could call just being not one, just being not one. If these entities, whatever they are not discernible but quantifiable. Namely, they have a cardinal but no ordinal number. We can attribute to the set of them a number, even though we could not count them by separating them and distinguishing them. And this is exactly the case of bosons in the quantum domain. So you see that there are ways of distinguishing objects, even though the usual criterion of distinction is not present. So this is interesting. But is it enough to say that there are indeed quantum objects? So let's inquire, for instance, if perhaps identity cannot become a substitute for individuality. You could say, okay, say you have two entities, or you believe there are two entities for any reason. And then you say, oh, entity 1 is the one that has trajectory 1. And entity 2 is defined as the one that has trajectory 2. Fine. Usually in classical physics, it would be perfectly okay, it would work. And you will see that some of the best definitions of particles in classical physics are based on the trajectory of point-like particles. But in quantum physics, once again, there is something called the uncertainty principle, so that the trajectories are blurred. And therefore, at a certain point, when the trajectories come very close to one another, they are mixed up. And you cannot say which one is going this path and which one is going the other path. For instance, when the spatial position is blurred in a certain central region, you could have two cases. One in which the particle 1 follows a straight line to the other point, and 2 follows a straight line to the other point also, and then they would be distinguished by following these two lines. But it could be the other way around. Namely, 1 could follow a crooked path, and 2 also follow the crooked path. And so after the evolution of the two entities, we would not know which one is 1 and which one is 2. We would have left the trace of these two entities and would mix them up. And perhaps there is, the extreme conclusion from this thought experiment would be that there is even no sense trying to distinguish between the two entities, that it is meaningless to distinguish between the two entities based on their trajectory, because there is no way to individualize the trajectories, not anymore than there is any way to individualize the properties of the entities. So we have completely lost the individuality of these entities. And without individuality, without even identity, some people would say there is no entity. Okay, about these famous trajectories, what can we say about the trajectories of the elementary particles? At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a device called Wilson chamber. Now there are other devices like, for instance, bubble chambers and many other devices that enable one to observe traces that look like trajectories. And so you can say, oh, look, these particles, these elementary particles, for instance, electrons here, have a trajectory. And therefore, since they have a trajectory, they can be distinguished, and therefore they can be identified, individualized. But Heisenberg thought a lot about this, and he suddenly realized that in order to make the theory compatible with the appearance of experiments, we should, in fact, modify the interpretation we give to these experiments, like the experiments of so-called trajectories in Wilson chambers. In fact, what we observe, says Heisenberg, is not a trajectory. It's a sort of, discontinuous sequence of little droplets in the moist ambience of the Wilson chamber. So we have little water droplets in the chamber, which are disposed in a very approximate way. And it is only by seeing them from above, from far away, that they look like a trajectory. So in fact, there are no trajectory at all, says Heisenberg. And this is the observation that yielded the so-called uncertainty relations. So in fact, no trajectory, no identity, no individuality. These particles these so-called particles have none of the characteristics that would enable us to take them as separate individual objects. The slogan, which was said by Quine, essentially, is no entity without identity. And this is all the more likely that at the end of the 19th century, in order to define what is usually called a material point or a particle in classical physics, Heinrich Hertz gave the following definition. He said, a material particle is a function by which we associate unambiguously a point of space at a certain time with another point at another time. Okay, a material particle is a function by which we associate one point to another, nothing else and nothing more. Now, if we cannot, as we have seen before, if we cannot associate unambiguously a point to another point, then there is no more particle, no more material particle in this sense, And this is why Schrödinger in 1952 said, what is a particle that has no trajectory or no path? To me, giving up the path seems giving up the particle. So, with no path, with no function to associate unambiguously one point to another, particles are gone. They have disappeared. And Schrödinger insists do these atoms and electrons and so on really exist? The particle, in the naive sense of the old way, of the old days, do not inherently exist. And the same for Quine in a paper called Whether Physical Objects. And he said, there are no such occupants in space-time. And we should speak of spatial locations as if they were in this or that state, rather than as if they were occupied by things, okay? Quine, at the end of his career, finished by with saying, in modern physics, there are no such things as occupiers of special positions that we can call elementary particles. So if we don't have this, namely usual particles in the usual sense, what do we have? The question is, what is there? What there is? And why do we have sometimes effects that look like there are particles after all? For instance, when we have an impact on the screen, we have the impression that something like a particle has impacted it, okay, has collided on it. But okay, but in fact, the answer, the most advanced answer to this date, and probably not the last one, is that there are fields, and that particles are nothing else than quantized levels of energy, of resonator of the vacuum that is occupied by such fields. In the same way as the so-called phonons, namely quanta of sound, are quantized levels of energy of resonators of a crystal. So photons and phonons are the same kind of non-things, namely just quantized levels of energy of something. One is quantized level of energy of the vacuum with a field, and the other is quantized levels of crystal. And the same for all the other particles, you know, to a certain extent, one can associate a field to each kind of particle you can have. And this corresponds very well to a beautiful expression of Schrödinger in 1925, a very visionary expression, where he said, particles are nothing but a foam crest on a fundamental ocean of the universe. And, you know, this is all the more striking that the number of particles is just called an observable, namely, it is relative to the type of measurement you do. It is especially relative to the state of the detector. And for instance, there is a very interesting phenomenon called Rindler quanta, in which, according to the acceleration or non-acceleration of the detector, you could detect either a number of particles or no particle at all in the same box that is supposed to have no particle in it. Because when the detector is not moving, you detect nothing. So in the vacuum, you could detect or not detect particles according to the state of the detector. So the idea that particles are here or not here, that they exist or do not exist inherently, completely disappears in this case, because in fact, what is called the number of particles is relative to the state of the detector. This is why some physicists say that particles have the mode of existence of a rainbow, because the rainbow has existence only relative to several factors, the sun, the drops of water, and the observer. And in the same case, particles are relative to the state of the device that the observer is using to detect them. So much so that there are some formulations of quantum physics with no ontology at all, which are called device-independent models. So I skipped this one. But there are also, you know, proposals not to get rid to any ontology whatsoever, but to try what I could call a mirror ontology, namely an ontology which is completely turned upside down with the usual ontology of substance and predicates. Instead of substance bearing predicates, you have predicates that bear certain numbers of what is usually called substance and is no longer substance. So this was proposed in a mathematical context by Desio-Krauss under the name of quasi-sets, in which the elements are defined in terms of the sets rather than the set being defined as a collection of elements. You could also do as Nishida Kitaro would have done, and in fact, he did that in connection with his contemplative practice, which is very interesting. He elaborated what he called a logic of place, which is a predicative logic in the radical sense, but not a logic of the grammatical subject. It is a subjective or existential logic prior to the position of subject and object. So, place is the holder of possible splittings between subject and object. But place comes before the split. And place is, the equivalent of the quasi-sets of Desio-Krauss, in which you define the elements that would bud from it in terms of the set or the place, rather than the set of the place being defined as a collection of entities. So let's now come to phenomenology. Why? Because in phenomenology, as I told you at the beginning of the talk, there is a procedure which can be called an archaeology of knowledge, or as Michel Foucault would say, an archaeology of the way we come to believe in entities, and we come to believe in permanent objects, extended objects that are still the same even when they change their aspect or they change their distance or anything. So we believe that we are having grasp on permanent objects. So according to Husserl, in order to clarify how we arrive at our ordinary belief in objects, we have to perform what he called a retrogression in several stages in order to arrive at primal self-evidences, which must then form the necessary point of departure for every elucidation of the origin of judgment. Judgment is this famous proposition having subject and predicate. This retrogression is performed by accepting to suspend judgment entirely, namely performing the epoche, and to revert to turn our attention to what is left after the epoche, namely, for instance, transcendental consciousness. And this second operation is called the phenomenological reduction. So, below the garb of ideas thrown over the world of immediate intuition and experience by elaborate logic and science, there is the perceptive contemplation of the pre-given sensuous substrate. So, according to Husserl, our belief in ordinary or scientific object is a garb of ideas thrown over the world of immediate intuition. So we have to strip this garb of ideas in order to find the immediate intuition and to find how we come to direct our attention towards the object we believe there is, when we see just aspects of it, when we see just a perspective of it, an adumbration of it, just that. And then objectification, namely holding in grasp an object throughout the variation of appearances, is an achievement of the ego, says Husserl. So we believe in the existence of object because nothing in the order of appearances prevents one from thinking that there is an object, a permanent and individual and self-identical object behind this sequence of varying appearances, beyond the flow or the stream of appearances over time. Okay, but now we should make a further distinction, which is also typical of phenomenology, between noema and object. In very simple characterizations given by Jocelyn Benoit, a Husserlian scholar based in Paris, and who is one of my good colleagues, he says the noema is the object in the how of its being aimed at. Namely, the noema is a tentative elaboration of a notion of object out of a limited set of appearances which make us believe that perhaps there is an object beyond that. And so there is a mode of aiming at the object, a limited and situated mode of aiming at object, and the noema is the object in the how of this being aiming it. But the object itself, according to Jocelyn Benoit also, is the presumably stable X determined by all the aspectual or partial or perspectival noemas, which assigns the point of possible convergence and divergence of various lines of sight. So we believe that beyond all these, gap of ideas, as Husserl said, beyond these intellectual constructions that aim at something that we believe is an object, there is a true object out there that we are trying to grasp. But this is, here again, this is just a belief. This is just a point of convergence of all the aspectual aiming at that are expressed by the intellectual preconception of something that might turn out to be an object. So a noema is a thought formation superimposed on the sensuous or experimental presentations to help channel the methods of its progressive determination. Unlike an object, a noema can drift in history, just as much as the thought process of which it is the concretion. Okay, this is a difference. Object is the ideal pole of identity of all our, I would say, operations of identification. In classical physics, the theoretical equivalent of noemas turned out to be sufficiently stable for them to be conflated with pre-given objects. Okay, the preconception we had of the classical objects could be stabilized, so much so that everything turned to be as if there were effective objects out there. But in quantum physics, it's not the case. There can be noema, but they regularly collapse by lack of self-identity, by lack of countability, by lack of individuality, and therefore the noemas cannot converge onto a pole of self-identity that we can treat as if it were a self-existent object. So that in the domain of quantum physics, especially in the interpretation called quantum Bayesianism or cubism, the whole hierarchy has been modified. Instead of saying that we have certain properties that we ascribe to a certain object, we say that we observe certain properties, and if they have enough criteria of stability and re-identification, we might temporarily identify them to an object. And this is what Jacques Pienard says, for instance. The usual approach, he says, assumes that the agent has some independent reasons for judging a set of measurements to be addressing a single system, okay, this famous self-identical object, and then imposes a certain normative relation as a necessary constraint on the agent's probability assignments that follow from this belief, okay? The belief in the self-identity of a system, guides our formulation of probabilities about the properties of this particular system. This is the usual way. But Jacques Pienard says that doesn't work in quantum physics. We should turn everything upside down. We should say that we should invert this logic. For suppose that an agent has independent reasons to assign a set of probability distribution such that the former normative relation holds, then the agent is licensed to postulate that these measurements are all addressing the same system. So it is only in the name of a normative rule for assessing probabilities that we can perhaps sometimes say that we are addressing a certain system. But this is just a tentative belief. It has no permanence, no stable, life. And Christopher Fuchs says, what is still called the quantum object or quantum system can be considered as a mere line drawn on sand, as an agent-defined target posited for all practical purposes on the basis of a few experimental signposts. Okay, so clearly in quantum physics, there are noema, but there are no objects in the proper sense of the word, because the noema are useful, to be sure, but as mental construct in order to frame the norm for formulating the probability of certain measurements, but we don't have enough stability to say that these noema converge onto something that behaves as if it were a self-existing object. So let me draw some conclusions to finish. In quantum physics, as we have seen, the garb of ideas thrown over the indeterminate and indefinite richness of a world in which we participate has been shown to be fragmentary, gaping, so much so that even the belief in individual and re-identifiable objects cannot hold any longer. So this garb of ideas is incapable of crystallizing permanently into a network of stable re-identifiable objects. And therefore, the experience of physicists can no longer be ignored in favor of its intentional object-like aims, okay? Namely, in quantum physics, it's impossible to forget the so-called life world of scientists in favor of their object. It is no longer possible to forget that these scientists have a lived experience in which and by which they aim at something that they believe to be physical systems. We are drawn back to lived experience, just as the phenomenological epoche draws us back to the so-called transcendental consciousness. And finally, language, with its logical structure, namely grammatical subject predicates, is seen as the contingent result of a pre-predicative, pre-logical experience that sometimes, especially in the micro world, fails to produce this logical structure. So it's very interesting that, at the very end of the project of framing an objective world, which was the typical project of natural science, we have met the limits of such project. We can no longer believe that there are sets of objects waiting for us in the outer world, and we just have to study them. The very notion of object has become problematic, has become just a pretension to existence, not something that we can claim to exist, properly speaking. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope there is time for questions.
Very much, Michel. Can they hear me? Yes. Okay, so we are now opening ourselves to discussion, but I'll take my chair's privilege and ask Michel first question myself, and that is, what do you think has to happen to our notion or notions of reality in light of the situation that you just described? And the second question, which is connected, how do we position the unity of reason in light of what you said, just discussed? And yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what notion of reality do we have? So the first thing, as you have understood, is that the notion of reality that survives the moment of quantum physics cannot be a reality seen as a big object or seen as a set of little objects. Neither a big object nor sets of little objects. If there is something like reality, it must have a very different, aspect. One possibility would be the one I personally favored, which is close to Merleau-Ponty's ontology, namely an ontology of what it is like to be a part of the world and belonging to the world, rather than an ontology of a world taken as an object of knowledge. So I would say it would be a very participatory notion of reality, a participatory ontology, instead of a standard ontology. The second point, what about the unity of reason? I think, yes, you are right. There might be a problem if we think that, reason has to operate in different realms and different domains. For instance, there is a reason that applies in the ordinary world, reason that applies in classical science or classical physics, and reason that applies to the quantum domain. But this is not the case, in fact. When you carefully analyze all the other domains, namely classical physics, classical science, ordinary perception, and so on, you realize that the same kind of rational approach can apply. Personally, I was very interested in the way Immanuel Kant changed completely the interpretation of Newtonian physics with respect to the physicists of his time. Instead of thinking that there are indeed, objects, material bodies that interact with one another with gravitational forces at a distance, he rather said that in fact Newtonian physics was ultimately concerned with phenomena. But phenomena that were liable to organization by the so-called categories of our pure understanding. So here, reason operates on phenomena. And I think in the case of quantum physics, it's exactly the same. Reason operates on phenomena, and at the beginning, it operates with nothing else. The question is, what can we do with these phenomena? Are the Kantian categories applicable to that or not? The answer is yes, they are applicable, but only in fragments, not in totalities. And this is why we have such problems in quantum physics. But nothing fundamental, I think, is changed in the mode of application of our reason to all these domains. There is a mode of a sort of unity, but a unity of, you know, of the fundamental application of reason to phenomena rather than the, you know, I would say, the dream of reason about the existence of object to which it can apply.
I'll take now, if you allow me, and you allow me, a kind of a risky move. And for the remaining 7 minutes, we'll open us into a panel, because just before you came in, we had a very interesting conversation with Harman, with whom I agree completely, and many, I think, in this audience would agree on the objects, realistic, speculative, realistic approach to the reality of objects or macro objects, maybe. So they serve for the macro world as anchors of truth and the substrates of judgments for phenomenology. So the question, is it okay, Michel, if I open it to Graham to invite him into this discussion more proactively? The question is that, do you allow me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes, of course, yes. I can hear.
I'm trying to bring in the question about the capacity of reason to embrace both kinds of thinking, both aspects of thinking, without reduction of one to the other. How do we do that? We either have to assume existence of some other kind of intuition, which is becoming nearly the intuition of God, in one sense, you know. We have either assume a presence of this other intuition, or we have to somehow in other ways build a bridge between the two perspectives without introducing the concept of multiple worlds or multiple realities. So the question is, can we do that? How do we do that? And it's, Graham, if you allow me also, please, I invite you into discussion.
Thank you very much, Olga. This is a difficult question, of course, but I think, you know, what was very striking to me was that, you know, as I told you, the most extreme attempt of science to reach the core of its object has yielded a necessity to turn back reflectively on oneself as, you know, the experiencer, the believer, the agent, all these elements that that compose our so-called life world. So it's interesting that you know, that this forced reflectivity is turning us back to the locus in which all the other modes of being, all the other kinds of belief can also arise, you know. For instance, there is this remarkable fact about quantum Bayesianism, cubism, in which you know, they say that facts are not properties of apparatus, for instance, but they are lived experiences of scientists. So that means that this lived experience that can have so many guises. There is the experience of perception, there is the experience of intellectual understanding, there is the experience of, say, spiritual contemplation, but this experience is the common locus of everything, you know, of everything that we can do. Science, ordinary life, and also spiritual experience, spiritual contemplation. So that means that this is the heart of the matter, experience, pure experience, as William James would say, or as Nishida Kitaro would say, okay? This is one of my reflections about this. Maybe it's not enough for you, but I think this is the, Husserl would say, this is the absolute origin of everything,
All right, Olga, you wanted me to say something?
Yes.
If you don't mind, it would be yes.
Not at all. No,
Yeah.
I followed this presentation with interest, and I wish I had had a copy of Michel's slides to look through as well. Maybe he'll send me one.
Yes.
If we, the problem, of course, when you're talking about objects is trying to figure out what it is you mean by object, and certain forms of object I would also rule out. But the kind of object I was talking about here was simply that which is discrete as opposed to the continuum. And of course, quantum mechanics is very much a theory of the discrete, even if we see that each particle has a field associated with it, or even if we say that the field is to be primary. Throughout, I mentioned in my paper that many different intellectual fields have struggled with this problem of the continuous and the discrete. And one of the problems they keep coming back to is the attempt to make one of these two primary. And the problem is if you decide to make one of the two primary, you end up with a difficulty in accounting for the other side of it, which is why I like the fact that Aristotle allows for both, that he allows for the continuum in the physics and for the discrete in the form of his substances in the metaphysics. Because let's look at the, if you take the discrete and say everything is fundamentally discrete, what you end up with is occasionalism, the kind of philosophy where God has to intervene directly in every causal interaction because things are so discrete, they're not able to make contact with each other. And this goes all the way back to early Islamic philosophy, or theology rather, where everything perishes every instant and God has to recreate everything and even give atoms their accidents. So that's what happens if you go too discrete. If you go too continuous, you end up with difficulty encountering individuals at all. And you end up with a continuum or something like the apeiron. So then you always end up with the question of why does it seem like the world is made of discrete things if it's really just a continuum? And the answer always seems to be some form of, it's the senses that show us that, or it's human thought that makes us think the world is made of multiple objects. But then the problem there is, how, if everything's an apeiron or everything's a continuum, how is human thought different enough from the rest of the continuum that it can generate these illusions for itself? So I think what you end up having to do in each of these fields is find some way to acknowledge both the discrete and the continuous and come up with some way that they interact. So I'm skeptical of any attempt to go too far in either direction.
Thank you. Yes. In order to say that there are objects that can be addressed at a certain level of our exploration, for instance, the microscopic level, we would have to have two things: not only discreteness, which is indeed realized at the level of quantum physics, but also a certain amount of permanence. And as you said, in quantum physics, it's much closer to this instantaneous discontinuity rather than the permanent version of it, in which you have some spatio-temporal continuum that you can take as if they were particles. So this is indeed a problem. Quantum physics is special because you try desperately to get the ordinary picture of spatial-temporal continuum, and you can't. This is a problem. And the only consistent ontology, the only completely consistent ontology in this case is rather the one that you try to repel, to eliminate, namely a combination of extreme continuity, the field, and extreme discontinuity, namely the instantaneous appearances that are connected with the counting of the so-called particles. So you see, so it's if you want to do otherwise, you run into troubles. This is the problem. Okay.
You must know this work by de Broglie, Continu et discontinu dans la physique moderne.
Yes.
It's wonderful. I was just reading that for the first time a couple of years ago. And what impresses me so much about him was his ability to see both sides of the question, and also his ability to see that philosophy has its own issues, that, for instance, freedom in physics might mean something different from freedom in philosophy. And so he, unlike many physicists, he wasn't trying to push for physics as the master discourse to which philosophy must submit itself, but he seemed to have a real, a very fine sense of the fact that each discipline is bound by its own rules of evidence and is bound by its own constraints.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
I wonder, is there any way in which you see philosophical discourse on these things as not entirely bound by whatever the current state of quantum theory is, especially given the ongoing problem between quantum theory and general relativity, the inability to unify them?
Yeah, thank you. You're right. It would be absurd to say that any philosophical discourse has to comply with the last conclusions of one of the most advanced theories in physics. I don't think that it would be appropriate. But what, for instance, what my examination of the case of quantum physics shows, and that the philosophers should take this into account, is that that the model of object cannot be universalized.
Mhm.
It's you have to be aware of the way you arrived at it and of the way you constituted it in Kant's or Husserl's terminology. And when you have no problem at all, you can forget it. You can forget the early stages of your cognition in which you progressively acquired the conviction that there are continuous objects out there. But if you arrive at a certain domain of knowledge in which this operation of constitution cannot be performed to the extremity, then you have to accept that this concept of object that is so familiar to you in everyday life cannot be universal. That's the only point.
All right.
There are, I would say, the domain of object is limited and blurred to its extremities.
Okay, well, so is this a good time to thank you both, and then say that we will be in touch, and I hope that we can continue engagement in this dialogue. If it was super interesting and extremely useful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you, Michel. Nice to hear your work.